So yeah, I think I've opened up that subject. First, let me just say, I think that climate change is the largest problem and most uniquely frightening problem humans have ever experienced because it threatens our future. You know, there's a real issue about whether, I mean, human beings will survive, but whether civilized people will survive is a real issue. And so I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge what a severe, and I think of it as an existential problem. By an existential problem, I mean it shapes the future of our existence. It's a question of whether the existence of people as we understand it will continue. Now, the second thing is, I think I wrote another book called Greed to Green, which looks at this subject in great detail. But it's very easy to read. And in it, what I talk about is the difference between being, which is very relevant for your generation, which is generally somewhat environmentally aware, saying the difference between being pale green and bright green. And what I mean is that pale green people are people who, which includes large numbers of your generation, who are aware of the environment, care about it, are aware that climate change is real, aware that people contribute to it, but who simply don't let it penetrate the way they live or their political behavior in any serious way. They kind of detach themselves emotionally and say, well, I can't really make an impact. Or the other way of being pale green is you say, well, I'm going to do what I can. I'm going to act on an individual basis. I'm going to recycle. I'm going to eat less meat. I'm going to use public transit if I can, rather than drive as much. And your generation is doing all of these things. The problem is that the individual behavior is important, but not because it's going to really solve the climate change problem, which, again, requires much larger structural and institutional change, because your recycling or my recycling is not going to make enough difference given the urgency and the rate at which, greenhouse gases are, concentrating in the atmosphere. So what we need, again, as I said in the last question, the problem is that our economy is based on endless consumption, the freedom to consume as much as possible, and that we have a fossil fuel-based capitalism and a fossil fuel-based military. The biggest military consumer the biggest producer of greenhouse gases is the Pentagon in the world, the single biggest producer. And of course, our wars are to a large degree fought, particularly in the Middle East, for oil, which is the source of most of the carbon that's polluting the environment. So the military is engaged in this in the sense that we use the military, and the military is very based on aviation. Most of our wars are very based on, and aviation is the single most carbon-producing kind of activity that most of us and that our society is involved with. So that's one thing. We need to change the nature of our military identity as the hegemonic superpower of the world. On an economic basis, we need to move away from an economy that sees its survival as based on endless consumption, which is just, I don't want to repeat the same thing I said last time, but what it means is we need to restructure the economy and rewrite the charter of the corporation in a way that says the corporation and the economy exist to serve the well-being of society and the public, not to just make money through selling commodities for a small number of big companies. And in another book, which I wrote called Corporation Nation, I look at the history of the corporation. I show even before the Civil War in the United States, corporations were not structured as profit. Corporations were able to make profit, but the charter of a corporation is the legal, each state has its own legal rules about how you set up a corporation and what the corporation is for and what the fiduciary obligation of the directors of the corporation are. For many years of our history, it was not profit. Profit was permitted, but the main purpose was to show that the business was contributing to the well-being of the community. And in fact, most corporate charters and particularly in regard to banks, but more generally with companies, required that the company had to go to the legislature every so number of years and demonstrate that the company was serving the community. And if it couldn't demonstrate that, it would be dismantled. It would not have, they were not immortal, and they were not seen as having an endless right to exist. So even in our own history, we have an example of how the economy can be restructured in a way that profit is not the principal or the only driving force. And in an era of climate change, this is not an academic issue. It's a crucially important human issue. And so basically, my view is that we need a new conversation about a post-consumer, mass consumer society. Again, how to consume, not without any consumption, but to consume smarter, leaner, in ways that really help us be better people and to feel happier, and not simply to consume in a way that generates large amounts of profit for a small number of corporations. So that's my fundamental argument, that climate change is so important. And again, it's been psychologized or personalized in the sense of saying, okay, I recycle, I ride my bicycle, and so forth, but it doesn't get at these larger fundamental changes. We need a completely new global tax system that taxes carbon. We need fundamentally different international economic treaties that prohibit rather than empower or enable companies to go abroad and simply emit more pollution and so forth. So we need large-scale global, because obviously it's a global problem. If you want to convince China, India, and other, Brazil and other developing countries, you've got to model it, the United States, how to restructure the way we live. And the bottom line of this is, I think climate change is simply a symptom, as crucial as it is, of a dysfunctional lifestyle and a dysfunctional economy. And if we want to be happier and live a more socially and psychologically and spiritually meaningful life, we need to look at how to reconfigure our lives. And that requires reconfiguring our economic institutions, our political institutions, our military institutions, and realizing that how we live is to a large extent a reflection of the institutions we establish that govern our lives.